Sitting on a high point that dominates the Somme landscape, High Wood was one of the most bitterly contested corners of the 1916 battlefield. Today its trees resound with the sound of birds, but more than a century ago, cavalry, flame, mines and tanks brought their special kind of warfare to High Wood. I don't know about you, but it does feel as if the world is beginning to emerge from the experiences that we've all had over the course of the last 15 months or so. It seems as if we're all beginning to do those things that we could describe as normal. Last week I was down in Sussex, the county of my birth, with my old friend John Hayes Fisher, walking the South Downs area and going along the paths and the lanes and across that chalk landscape which is so reminiscent of the Somme. I think one of the reasons I've always been so connected to the Somme area, apart from its history, is the familiarity of the terrain, the way it feels like Sussex, where I grew up. And as we had a few days going round Sussex villages, once again in churches tucked away in the quiet corners of that county, were war memorials with familiar names and lists of places and dates that somehow transported me back to the old front line. So while those sort of things are now possible, getting back to the battlefields of the Great War is still a distant horizon. Quite when we'll return, who knows at the moment, hopefully sometime in the next few months. This week I found myself back at work at Leisure Holidays, beginning the process to restart our battlefield tours, whenever that will be. And all of this, I guess, will make us, certainly makes me think about how quiet those places must have been in the course of this last 15 months, and how desperately, really, the people who work there, who live there, who have businesses there, need us to return. The infrastructure on these battlefields is part of the way in which we help preserve it, help ensure that it doesn't disappear. So much when I look back over the 40 years nearly that I've been visiting the battlefields of the Western Front, so much of it has disappeared, has gone. Mine craters filled in, little areas of trenches ploughed over. And I would say in the 1980s into the 90s, that accelerated a little bit because there was so little interest in the Great War, so few people visiting those battlefields. So many summers I tramped around those places and never saw another English-speaking person. But that has all changed, and the infrastructure that we've perhaps taken for granted on these battlefields is part of that change and part of the way in which we ensure the interest continues, ensure visitors continue, and ensure that these places no longer disappear in the way that they have done, sadly, in those years past. Many of those who've been visiting the battlefields of the Great War for a long time will perhaps look back on that period in the 80s, and those who were there in the 70s and the years before, as some sort of golden age. And while the battlefields were less changed than they are now, and some no doubt would welcome the fact there were no visitor centres as such in those days, for me I'll never see it as a golden period because so much was lost. And the Great War was far from the minds of most ordinary people, whereas I would like to believe that has changed certainly a great deal since, and indeed during, the First World War centenary. So as we begin to emerge like soldiers coming out of a dugout after a long bombardment has kept them deep underground, we emerge like them, blinking our eyes and wondering what lays ahead, and wondering when, for us, our return will be to the old front line. As we begin to go back to that normality, whatever that new normality will be, a few of you have asked on social media what is the future of the podcast. I have no plans to change what I've been doing for the last year or so, and will continue to bring you episodes on a weekly basis, on a regular basis, on whatever sort of basis your interest in this podcast continues to dictate. And the thing that will change really is not the frequency of it really, it will be the way the content will change once I can get back to those places and record on the ground. The visit that I made last summer in between the lockdowns, when myself and Mark Allen and Tim Thurlow had a week on the battlefields of Flanders to record some episodes there on the ground with the sounds and the noises and the landscape around us to inspire really what we're talking about. That felt as if it was a different level of podcast, and that's something that I look forward to reviving once that's possible again. And I want to take this opportunity to thank those of you who support the podcast, whether that's by downloading the podcast and listening to it on a regular basis, by commenting on social media, and those of you as well who very kindly directly support the production of the podcast via Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. The podcast will always be free. Some of you may have seen news recently that Apple and perhaps some other platforms begin to offer the option of a subscription service to podcasts. That is not something that I intend to do. One of the underlying principles of the podcast from the start was to make it free to everyone, particularly in this last year or so when things have been hard for people. So that will continue, but those of you who do support it via Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon, you do help to continue and help me to move things forward. And again, once return to the battlefields is possible, I hope to bring some new dimensions to what we do at the Old Front Line through video and through a few other things as well. So this is not the beginning of the ends, it's the beginning of the next phase, I hope, as we do emerge from those dark times we've had over these past months and begin to live a normal life again, and for all of us, I hope, return to those battlefields of the Great War. And return to them now virtually we will once more, as we pack our rucksack, pull on our virtual boots, and head this week to the Somme. We begin our walk this week just outside the village of Longueval on the Somme battlefields, and we're in one of the larger cemeteries of this area, Caterpillar Valley Cemetery. It sits on a high point with quite commanding views back into the village of Longueval, but across the valley in front of it towards another ridgeline on which sits a wood, the Bois de Foucault, or High Wood as we called it, the scene of almost 2 months of constant fighting in 1916, which we're going to look at some aspects of during the course of this walk as we walk from here to High Wood itself. Now, why is this cemetery called Caterpillar Valley? Well, Caterpillar Valley itself, the Vallée du Bois as it's called in French, runs not really near Longueval or even that close to this cemetery. It's between the villages of Montauban and over across towards Mametz. It's a deep and long, wriggly-shaped valley, which from the air looks like a wriggling caterpillar, and that's how it's got its name. It was an area at the beginning of the Battle of the Somme that was behind the German lines. The Germans actually had tiered barracks built into the slopes of the valley, where soldiers were billeted going to and from the trenches. Post-war, the valley being in a very isolated position between those two villages of Montauban and Mametz, it was a safe place to bring all the discarded ammunition and shells and grenades and everything else that were being picked up in the post-war battlefield clearances and bring them to that point in a valley and detonate them, destroy them. And back in the 80s, in those early years of coming across to the Western Front, coming across to the Somme, one of my friends, Yves Foucault, mentioned to me that if you walk down there during the spring or the autumn, you'll find quite a lot of fuses from shells, often blown apart, where they'd been in shells that had been stacked up, possibly by men of the Chinese Labour Corps just after the war, and then detonated with explosives to destroy them in this isolated location and get rid of them. And indeed, in those days you could walk down bits of that valley and there would be huge amounts of shell fragment and bits of fuses and driving band and everything else, and it would be scattered all across the field. So not from a bombardment, but from a post-war explosion when the battlefields had been cleared. It must have been some sort of general dumping ground as well, because in the undergrowth along that valley there, it was a place that you often found bottles from the Great War. Not broken ones, complete ones, just lying there amongst the bushes. HP sauce, camp coffee, I found several of those. Now, it's land that is farmed, it is land that is in private hands. We went there then with the permission of the people who farmed it. And I would say to you now, if you go there expecting to find these treasured souvenirs these days, I'm talking about something that is nearly 40 years ago now, and there is very little of that sort of material left on the surface. The battlefields of the Great War still give up their secrets, as we heard from Tim Thurlow in an early episode of this podcast. There are still things to be found, but very often these days it is in places way out, away from an area where people visit on a regular basis, and in places where there was lots of periods of long, intensive fighting. But when you look at accounts on social media of people who go mudlarking on the Thames, and you see the age of some of the material that they find, it makes you realise that in these battlefields of the Great War, and on these battlefields of the Great War, these artefacts will be continued to be found for many, many centuries. Long after we're all gone, they will still be finding the odd button, the odd bit of rum jar, and the odd bit of shell fragment as they walk that ground where all that time before the 4 years of the Great War had raged. So the cemetery was named after that valley, and while it is a cemetery that we would connect with the 1916 Somme battlefields, its original plot actually dates from the fighting here in August of 1918 in the second and final Battle of the Somme. The 38th Welsh Division, who we've spoken about in a previous podcast on Mametz Wood, an area where they fought in July 1916, were heavily involved in that period of the conflict here across these Somme battlefields. They were occupying the British front line north of Albert that summer around Avalui Wood, and they crossed the River Onk in their assault in the final battle that really reclaimed all this land and pushed the Germans back out of the Somme region. Their men actually swam the River Onk close to Avalui Wood at that time. They then continued with their advance, going across some of the old villages and the ground and the old trench lines from the 1916 battle, and that would eventually bring them to capture this ground here at Longueval and then continue with their assault towards the Morval Ridge. And there are a number of points when you follow the line of their advance in August of 1918 where you see cemeteries that began with a nucleus of their burials from that time. And there is a plot in here of men from Welsh regiments, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the Welsh Regiment itself, South Wales Borders and some of the supporting units like Machine Gun Corps. There's a plot of their men here, and that was where the cemetery began. So it wasn't a 1916 cemetery in its original inception. It was from the final year of the war, and then post-war, when it was decided to make this a permanent cemetery, graves were then moved in from the surrounding area when the battlefields were cleared, and while they were finding all that detritus that they blew up in Caterpillar Valley, they were also finding the remains of soldiers predominantly killed in the 1916 fighting. So when we wander round this cemetery of 5,568 burials, we see that the majority, 3,795 of them, are unidentified soldiers. Occasionally a regiment or a rank is known, but their identity is not known. When we look amongst the rows and when we walk round this cemetery and we look at the identified graves, we see that many of them are men who fell in the fighting for High Wood, which we can see, as I mentioned earlier, from the cemetery itself. And one of those that I particularly visit in here is Captain Leslie Davis of the 1st 15th Battalion of the London Regiment, the Civil Service Rifles, who was killed at High Wood on the 15th of September 1916. Now, when I lived in France, I used to go to the brocante, the car boot sales as we'd call them, and you'd find all sorts of Great War-related items there, and including postcards, often postcards given by British soldiers to French civilians. And I picked up a picture of Captain Leslie Davis that he'd given to a French mademoiselle some time before the Battle of the Somme. No real clue as to who she was, and one wonders what the story was between the two of them. But it's a treasured item because it links British soldiers serving there overseas, a young man in his early 20s. He was only 22 when he was killed at High Wood. And there he was meeting that Somme mademoiselle, both of them young people and soldiers like him far from home. They wonder what future lies ahead. And I like to think that there was something between them at least. And the giving of the postcards obviously indicated that he meant something to her and she meant something to him. And she obviously kept that for the rest of her life. And it ended up in a barn or in a loft somewhere. And future generations did not understand the significance of it. But it rests with me now, like I say, as a treasured souvenir of one man's journey to the Somme in 1916. Leslie Davis was from Highgate in London. He'd been educated at Winchester House School at Deal in Kent, and he'd worked before the war for the Clerical, Medical and General Assurance Society. He was one of the original officers of the Civil Service Rifles. He'd come across to France with them in early 1915. He'd fought at the Battle of Loos, and where he's buried with two other Civil Service Rifles officers, these were bodies that were buried in a shell hole close to High Wood, and then their remains exhumed from that battlefield burial site and brought here after the war. A typical story of probably the majority of the graves that are in this cemetery. Now, as we wander along the rows, we see that the unknown graves are not just men from British regiments. There are many of the Commonwealth regiments here as well, Australians from the fighting at Pozieres, a few Canadians from Courcelette, and lots of New Zealanders from the fighting here in September through to October of 1916, when the New Zealand Division was very heavily involved. In fact, from the cemetery, again, looking out towards High Wood and looking slightly to the right of it, you can see the white obelisk of the New Zealand Division Memorial standing there on the switchline trench that ran at the back of High Wood from Martinpuy across round the back of Delville Wood and to the highest points in the grounds beyond Fleurs and towards the Le Transloy Ridge. So the New Zealand Division, this was their battlefield in 1916, and many of their dead are buried here. There's also a wall at the back of the cemetery, which is the New Zealand Memorial to the Missing of Caterpillar Valley. The New Zealand government decided that after the war, when it came to commemorating their missing soldiers, they would not put them on the main memorials. They would give them battlefield memorial sites. We discussed this when we went to Polygon Wood and we saw the New Zealand Memorial to the Missing there that commemorated those who'd fallen in the post-Passchendaele period. And here, this wall at the back of Caterpillar Valley Cemetery commemorates just over 1,200 men from the New Zealand Expeditionary Force who fell on the Somme and have no known grave. One of them that I researched some years ago was Lance Corporal Henry Palin of the Canterbury Regiment. Like many men of Commonwealth nations, he wasn't born in New Zealand. Many of these Commonwealth soldiers were born in Britain. The highest percentage of that was with the Canadians, but even amongst Australian and New Zealand soldiers, quite a proportion of the original enlistees were men not born in those nations but born in Britain and then emigrated. Henry Palin was the son of a vicar who'd travelled to India and then ended up in New Zealand on the outbreak of the war, and he joined up almost immediately into the Canterbury Regiment. He served with them at Gallipoli in 1915 and then in Egypt, and then he came to France via Marseille in the spring of 1916. His first major time in action here on the Western Front was on the 15th September 1916 in the attack between Fleurs and High Wood, when the New Zealand Division advanced very close to where that memorial is out in the fields, we can see from this cemetery. And he remained in this sector until he was killed in action in the assault on Gerd Trench near Factory Corner on the 27th of September. There's a report in his service file, and the New Zealand government have placed all of their service records online now, so it makes researching these men quite easy. And in his file, a comrade who'd survived the battle recorded that he saw Lance Corporal Palin peering over a shell crater, about to take a shot with his rifle, when he was struck by a bullet and killed instantaneously. His body was never recovered. He may have been buried in a shell hole at the time, but an identified burial site was not found after the war, and his name was added to this memorial. And with a name like Lance Corporal Palin, it's probably not that difficult to realise that he's related to Michael Palin. And we brought Michael here in 2008 when we made The Last Day of World War One for BBC. And he'd always been fascinated to know the story of his great uncle who died in the war. And not only did we bring him here to see the name, we actually went out to the area around Factory Corner so he could stand and, like all of those who go to visit the place where their relative met his journey's end, he was greatly moved by it. We frequently hear about the role and the service and the battles in which Anzac troops took part in the Great War, but I often think that the NZ in Anzac is all too easy to overlook. The New Zealand forces had fought alongside their Australian counterparts at Gallipoli in 1915, but after that gone their separate ways with the creation of Australian divisions and the single New Zealand division. By the end of the Great War, over 18,000 New Zealanders had been killed in action, 50,000 wounded, and for a tiny nation like that, with a relatively small population, this was not an insignificant number of men. Hailing from the other side of the world, travel to battlefields like these in the post-war world must have been a difficult prospect, and I don't know of any big organised pilgrimages from New Zealand to the battlefields where New Zealand soldiers had fought here in France and Flanders. And in many respects, when I first came across to these battlefields in the 80s, I think the number of New Zealanders who visited these sites you could probably count on one hand. But gradually, as we approached the 90s on into the early 2000s, interests right across the Commonwealth began to grow, and that was a good thing to see. And on the 6th of November 2004, the New Zealand government came here to Caterpillar Valley to plot 24, row A, grave 27, where they exhumed the body of an unknown New Zealand soldier to be taken back to New Zealand to be buried in their tomb of the unknown warrior. And today, where that grave was, is a special headstone recording this event. And I'll put a picture of that onto the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk. Now, as you'll no doubt remember from a previous episode of the Old Front Line, when we looked at the story of the unknown warrior after the Great War, the one that's in Westminster Abbey was meant to symbolise them all. But the Commonwealth nations in that period in which this interest began to grow essentially decided that they wanted their own unknown warrior to be taken back home to those countries. And it began with Australia on the Somme in the 1990s, with the exhumation of an unknown Australian soldier at Adelaide Cemetery near Villers-Bretonneux on the Somme. And then in the year 2000, we witnessed Operation Memoria, which was when the Canadians came to northern France and exhumed the body of an unknown Canadian soldier from Cabaret Rouge Cemetery and took him back to the Peace Tower in Ottawa, where he's buried in the tomb of the unknown warrior there. And the New Zealanders followed in 2004 with this grave here on the Somme. And although I guess at the time the Commonwealth War Graves Commission were not incredibly keen on the idea of soldiers being exhumed from their cemeteries and repatriated home, nevertheless I think these three separate projects help move forward, help generate interest in those Commonwealth nations and help spread the word as to what those countries had done, major contributions to victory in those 4 years of the Great War, and that they paid such a heavy price and it needed to be remembered. And I think that when you look at the grave here where we're standing now and see the number of New Zealand flags placed in front of it, it's now an empty tomb. This soldier is back in New Zealand, but many New Zealanders come here to pay their respects, and that can only be a good thing. So we'll leave the cemetery by the archway entrance now, go down the steps onto the road. We'll turn right towards the village of Longueval. We'll walk down the road a little way, and just as we get up to the next road junction where the road goes off to the left, signposted to Martinpuy, and it would take you past High Wood, there's a little side turning to our right with an embankment, and we'll turn there, go up that embankment to a new memorial. Standing on top of this embankment, we've got quite a good view again across this battlefield in front of High Wood, and we can see again what a dominant position the wood sits on, and how the valley beneath it potentially could easily be a kill zone, as it was sadly so often in 1916. And the memorial that we've come to see here was placed here during the Great War centenary. It's an Indian memorial commemorating the role of Indian troops here during the Battle of the Somme. Now, we know again from previous podcast episodes that the Indians were very heavily involved in the battles of 1914-15 at places like Ypres and Neuve-Chapelle, and we visited the Indian Corps Memorial at Neuve-Chapelle. After that period, after the end of 1915, with the Indian Corps attack at the Moulin de Pietri as part of one of the diversionary operations for the Battle of Loos, the bulk of those Indian troops were moved out of France to other theatres of war. But eventually, men from the Indian Labour Corps would come to the Western Front, and cavalry units, Indian cavalry units, would remain here for the rest of the war. And in one of the attacks on High Wood on the 14th of July 1916, two cavalry units, the 20th Deccan Horse and the 7th Dragoon Guards of the British Army, made an assault across that valley towards High Wood. They'd come up along Death Valley, by Mametz Wood, out onto the Bazantan Road, formed up near to Crucifix Corner, and then gone across those fields, overgrown farmland, with high grass and poppies amongst the grass, cantered their way towards the wood. Now, there are many myths about this part of the Battle of the Somme. I grew up reading Charlie's War, that great comic from the 1970s and 80s, and this attack was depicted in Charlie's War as an absolute massacre. And there are several books in which the massacre of these cavalry units here is described. But when you look at the actual history of it, it was not a massacre. Actually, the cavalry assault took the Germans completely by surprise, and the cavalry crossed that open ground with pretty minimal casualties. But when they got to the wood, cavalry is good at capturing a position, but it can't hold it. It needs the infantry to do that, and the infantry was too far behind, and the cavalry was too exposed to stay there, so they had to eventually withdraw, and the ground returns to German occupation, and the fighting for High Wood continued. So although the assault and the initial capture of that ground in the approaches to High Wood had been successful on the part of the cavalry, they couldn't remain there indefinitely. The failure of the infantry being too far behind wasn't the failure of those individual battalions, but the placing of reserves was too far back, and they couldn't exploit the situation that the cavalry had developed by this quick and rapid assault. So the wood remained in German hands, and the battle continued for the next 2 months. Now, this memorial was placed here by members of the Indian community, I think within the UK, and also obviously from India itself. I looked it up on the internet to get a few details about it, and I saw on quite a few things like the Great War Forum some not exactly complimentary remarks, but this is a memorial built by the Indian community to commemorate Indian Army soldiers, and it's something that was lacking from this part of the Western Front, and it's to be welcomed in that respect, I think. Standing here, when you look across that valley and you try to imagine in your mind's eye that force of hundreds of riders on their horses crossing that ground, the thundering noise that cavalry made, to be a German soldier and stand against that. German soldiers, by this stage of the war, this was the last vestiges of the German regular army. I'm not entirely convinced that these men were particularly trained to withstand that sort of assault. Deccan Horse with lances, Dragoon Guards with flashing sabres coming straight at them. I think most German soldiers would have turned and bolted and run. So cavalry had its place and could, and indeed was, used well at different points in the war, but in the wrong scenario it could result in a bloodbath. And at some point in the future we will visit the ground around Monchy-le-Preux at Arras, where one of the cavalry brigades went into the assault there under murderous German fire, and the battlefield was then covered with the bodies of cavalry troopers and their mounts, the horses, killed in that attack. So from here we'll return to the road, and we'll return to that junction, and we'll see another memorial on the corner there. It's a wooden cross that commemorates the men from the 12th Battalion, the Gloucestershire Regiment, which was the Bristol City Battalion. This was the Bristol Pals Battalion that fought here in the fighting around Longueval and High Wood in 1916. We'll return to a bit more about their story another day, and we'll continue on into the village, go past the Pipers Memorial on the left-hand side, which dates from about 20 odd years ago when a group came across and erected this memorial with the badges of British and Commonwealth regiments, not entirely just Scottish ones, that had pipers within them, and this symbolises a piper going over the top. Again, another modern memorial that doesn't suit the taste of every visitor that came here, but we'll turn left in Longueval village, and we're going to head down out of the village to a fork in the road, where the road goes off to the right towards Fleurs. We'll take the left-hand fork. It'll take us out across towards the fields and towards a big crucifix we can see just up ahead on the right-hand side. Now, there are a few places on the Somme battlefields, and indeed a few other battlefields, that are called Crucifix Corner because of a big crucifix like this sitting at a road junction. This isn't one of them. It just happens to be a point here at Longueval where there is this crucifix, and it sits coincidentally on a site that connects us to Major William Latouche Congreve, VC, of the Rifle Brigade, Billy Congreve. Billy Congreve was killed near this spot on the 20th of July 1916 when he was working as a brigade major. We'll say more about that shortly. He would be subsequently awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously for his bravery here. His father was Walter Congreve, a Corps commander, who'd been awarded the Victoria Cross at Colenso during the Boer War in 1899, and this was one of a few examples of both father and son being awarded the ultimate medal for gallantry, the VC, the Victoria Cross. Billy Congreve was a regular soldier who'd been commissioned in the Rifle Brigade. He was serving with the 3rd Battalion Rifle Brigade on the outbreak of war and came to France with them in August 1914. Terry Norman, who wrote the excellent book on Highwood, which I'll put on the podcast website, also did a biography of Billy Congreve. Both of these books, as far as I'm aware, are out of print, but I'll put some links to them on the website so you can look them up. They're both highly recommended. After a stint with his original battalion, he was promoted to become a staff officer in the 3rd Infantry Division, and he served with them in the battles around Ypres, particularly in 1915. I often think of him when I go through the main square at Ypres because he crossed that on numerous occasions and went out through the Menin Gate to go up to the front line around Hooge. And in the battle there on the 16th of June 1915, he was awarded the Military Cross for his bravery. Later, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, the DSO, for his bravery in the fighting at Saint-Éloi and the Battle of the Saint-Éloi Craters and the operations on the Bluff. And then his unit moved south, eventually to take part in the Battle of the Somme. But he'd gone home on leave, and he married his sweetheart, Pamela Maud, on the 1st of June 1916, just a month before the Battle of the Somme began. After only a tragically short time together, he returned to the fronts and resumed his role as a brigade major. This was a position, a unique position in some respects within the British Army, in which a junior officer of relatively junior rank was the eyes and ears of the brigadier on the battlefield. So the brigadier general commanding a particular brigade, in this instance the 76th Infantry Brigade, part of that 3rd Division, had Billy Congreve out there on the battlefield really reacting to what was going on and acting as a proxy brigadier on the ground. So if the situation was going badly and senior officers, battalion commanders or company commanders had been killed or wounded, he could step in and give direct orders to get the battle moving again and to react to the conditions on the ground. And it meant that there he was in the midst of shot and shell and all hell breaking loose in big attacks. His position, to put it mildly, was a pretty exposed one, and the life expectancy of brigade majors like him was pretty short indeed. And the battlefields, the cemeteries of these battlefields, contain the graves of many brigade majors, incredibly brave young soldiers killed in trying to turn the tide of battle in some of the key moments of the battles along the Western Front in the Great War. And sadly for Billy Congreve, it was here, close to this crucifix where we're standing now, is where his war came to an end. in the midst of the operations that were taking place here on the edge of Longueval as units were trying to push forward towards the high ground around High Wood, that he was killed, it was said, by a sniper. His body was taken back to Corby. That's where his grave is. He wasn't buried here on this particular battlefield. His father was out at rest in that area at the time as a corps commander with the units from his corps, and he went to see his son's body before it was buried. And it's buried in a slightly separate grave in Corby Cemetery. As you go up the main steps, it's almost the first grave that you see as you walk in, just on the left. So Billy Congreve's voice really comes across strongly in that book by Terry Norman, Armageddon Road. Like I say, I'll put a link to that on the podcast website. And when you read about that terribly short life that him and Pamela had together, it wasn't entirely unfulfilled, because Pamela gave birth to their daughter in March 1917. Their daughter Mary lived a long and eventful life, only passing away in 1992. And I wonder what children like her made of fathers that they never knew, who were just a photograph, a whisper on their mother's lips, not even a distant memory for them. The only thing they had was the grave in a cemetery somewhere, or a name on a wall. Again, very much a part of that legacy that the Great War left so many in those years after 1918. So from the crucifix, we'll effectively go left. If we continued on the road ahead of us, it would take us up to the New Zealand Division Memorial out on that high point near to the switch line. So we'll go round to the left, and a little bit further up it becomes slightly sunken, and then another sunken lane goes off to the right, and we'll take that and stop. The track we're walking up now is marked on British trench maps as Wood Lane. It was the lane that took you to the wood, in this case, obviously High Wood. And we're walking up one part of the High Wood battlefield of that July to September 1916 period. High Wood sitting on that high point was obviously an objective that had to be taken if the British were going to advance in this area. And in the assault on the 14th of July, the Battle of Bazentin, the village of Bazentin was taken. The Indian and the British cavalry moved up to try and take the wood. The infantry was too far back. The ground around Bazentin itself was taken, but the wood remained in German hands. And that marked really the beginning of nearly 2 months, almost exactly 2 months worth of fighting until the capture of the wood on the 15th of September 1916. It was a battlefield that mirrored really what was happening on the wider Western Front and on the wider battlefields of the Great War, because that initial assault with infantry and cavalry, that was the old world, the world that was passing, and the capture of the wood saw the first use of tanks. That date, 15th of September 1916, was the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, when these tanks were used by the British for the very first time. So the fighting here reflected that. It went from the old type of fighting to modern warfare, and in between just about everything else. Flamethrowers, tunnelling, so mines, aircraft being used to drop bombs or strafe the ground, and then the whole approach to the change in infantry fighting with creeping barrages and the greater cooperation between infantry and other parts of the army that supported them, most notably the engineers and the artillery. But it wasn't just two battles at the beginning and the end. In between those two dates of the 14th of July and the 15th of September 1916, attack after attack went through here. Unit after unit passed across this ground. The Birmingham POWs battalions are very closely associated with the fighting here at Wood Lane, for example. But we could look in that field just to the left as we're walking up, as the ground rises and the wood becomes more apparent ahead of us. We could really list an entire archive of regiments of the British Army that took part in assaults across this ground on this side of the wood or on the far side of it, actually facing the wood itself from Bazentin, unit after unit, and sometimes not even directly fighting, just holding the line. One of my veteran pals, Jock Gaffron, was here with the Gordon Highlanders in the summer of 1916, and they were working on the trenches in front of the wood. They'd been delivered a big pile of timber to shore up the trenches that they were holding, and it was very, very warm, and he'd stripped down just to his kilt cover, so a little bit of khaki to hide his modesty, and he was sitting on top of this pile of this timber keeping an eye out while the guys fetched the timber and then chopped it up or used it as supports, when a German aircraft buzzed over, and he rapidly got himself off this pile of timber, forgetting that he wasn't wearing his kilt, and his backside scraped along roughly cut timber and ended up not with shrapnel wounds but with splinter wounds, splinters of wood in his backside, and he had to go rather embarrassed to the field ambulance with this type of injury. And he said the medics took delight in rather aggressively pulling these splinters out of his backside, and he said that it hurt more than when he lost his leg later in the fighting on the Western Front, which I find difficult to believe, but I think obviously it had a great impression on him. But returning to the fighting that took place in these fields, as we move up Wood Lane and come up on towards the crest of the plateau here, we're walking just a few minutes, really, 10-15 minutes to cross this bit of ground, but we're looking at months worth of fighting as they moved from shell hole to shell hole, collected shell holes that they'd captured and connected up to the next set of shell holes, bits of trench. It was very slow-paced, the fighting here in that summer of 1916. Slow-paced, but with great cost. Unit after unit was annihilated across this ground with a huge amount of unburied dead. And when you look at the attacks that were here, and you then look up the men that were killed in that particular attack, you see that in many cases very few of them have known graves. And in the years of when I lived at Courcelette and walked around these battlefields and just generally visiting them, this is a part of the Western Front in which the remains of soldiers are found very, very frequently. It was an area in which there was a large amount of missing, and that missing still gives up their secrets as the remains of these men are found even after a century later. As we get up to the top, we meet a junction of tracks, and we're now on one corner of the wood, and we can begin to see what a large area of woodland high wood is. We'll turn left at this track and walk along the edge of the wood, and just up ahead on the right we'll see just through the trees what looks like a lake. In fact, it's a flooded mine crater, more of that in a minute, and just beyond it, in a neatly cut grass embankment, is a memorial that commemorates the men of the 1st Battalion, the Cameron Highlanders, and the 1st Battalion Black Watch, two Scottish regiments of the 1st Infantry Division that fought here in the fighting of September 1916 and suffered heavy casualties. This memorial replaces an original wooden construction that was placed here just after the fighting, and then was decided to make a permanent memorial. The 1st Division also had its own memorial cross here, and in looking at the men from the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, who fought in the fighting in this area in one of the attacks on High Wood, many of these Sussex lads have no known grave. They're now commemorated on the Thiepval Memorial to the missing. But they were sent at the time, their families rather were sent at the time, the Imperial War Graves Commission wallets that was used to send a picture of a grave in a cemetery somewhere in France or Flanders. They were sent, the families were sent these, not with a picture of a grave because there was no grave, but a picture of the 1st Division cross. This is a common thing I've seen in some of the archives of these men who were killed in this battle. So that memorial was never replaced with a divisional memorial, but this 2 Battalion memorial that commemorates the Cameron Highlanders and the Black Watch was replaced with a permanent monument. And just where it joins with the edge of the wood, you can see the ornamental pond, which is the mine craters. So this was part of one of the operations against High Wood in September of 1916. On the 3rd of September, a push pipe mine was employed here, where they pushed a series of pipes containing a charge of 3,000 pounds of explosive underneath the German position here and blew it, creating a mine crater. Now, this was meant to help the units that were attacking here at that time capture this ground, but their assault was held up and the Germans got into the mine crater and then took it. In a second attack on the 9th of September, the same tunnelling company used another push pipe mine and blew a second 3,000 pound charge, turning this into a double crater. And again, the Germans quickly took it following the explosion of the mines. So this implementation of mines was not as successful as it had been in other areas, and would be successful the following year, of course, in the Battle of Messines. Now, we're on quite high ground here, and you probably would think that the mine craters is chalk downland. Perhaps they should be empty, not full of water. But for whatever reason, whether the explosions damaged an underground fissure, the craters are permanently full of water. And a few years ago, a local collector actually dived into these craters. He got permission to do so and pulled out all sorts of material that had been dumped in there after the war, a lot of it in pretty good condition. Dominic Zanardi at Latomy used to have some of this on display in his cafe museum there. So again, in that post-war period when the big clear-up was going on, big holes in the ground, particularly ones full of water, were probably very inviting for these groups of British and Chinese soldiers that were clearing up the detritus of war. Oh, there's a nice big hole full of water, let's just go and dump a load of stuff in there and get rid of it. That's what happened, and right across the Western Front, a lot of the old shell holes were filled in with this detritus they were clearing up. Some years ago when, for example, the diggers unearthed the battlefield around Boesinger, they found quite a few of these shell craters that had been used to dump the barbed wire. And they did some nice cross-sections, archaeological cross-sections in there, in which you could see the different strata of battlefield junk that had been dumped in there over a period of time. Now, the craters today, and indeed the whole wood, is private property. It's not, as a lot of people believe, the property of the house that is in the far corner from where we are now. They own a little bit of land around their property, but they do not own the rest of the wood. It's quite a complex ownership. It's owned by a number of people. And at one stage, back in the 60s and 70s, there was strip farming going on right in the centre of the wood. If you look at aerial images on Google Earth or some of the Western Front Association images they took in the 80s, you can see this quite clearly. And it means that actually at ground level within the wood, having been able to get in there myself with permission of the mayor of Longueval and the mayor of Martinpuy, because that's the other complication here, is that the wood is in two different communes and two different départements. Martinpuy, which is in the Pas-de-Calais, Longueval, which is in the Somme. So with their permission many years ago, I got into the wood. There is very, very little at ground level. In fact, the craters are probably the biggest remains of the First World War that are visible on that bit of the landscape within the wood itself. It was a wood smashed to bits by artillery fire in 1916. It was an area fought over again in 1918, and it was basically pulverised ground. So all you can see is undulations. There's no trench system in there. There's a couple of bits of concrete, but there's no great positions to go and see, which was what you'd normally see in a wood somewhere on the Somme. But what it does, of course, indicate is just how badly destroyed this ground was in those years of the First World War, that it was smashed to bits. So not even the positions that were dug here in the wood were visible. Not even the switch line that runs through one corner of it is visible there. So if you're ever tempted to go in the wood, it is private property. Best thing is to approach the mayors of those villages, get proper permission to go in there. But there's very little in reality that you're going to see. So we'll continue along the edge of the wood. We get to the end and we meet the main road, the road from Longueval to Martinpuy. We'll turn right, and just up on the right hand side is another memorial, this one to the 47th London Division. This was a London territorial division, so these were territorial battalions of the London Regiment, units like the Post Office Rifles and the Civil Service Rifles, which Leslie Davies, who we spoke about, was a member of. London Irish Rifles were in this division. We spoke about them in an episode of the podcast on the fighting at Loos in September 1915, which was their first big battle. And after Loos, they'd served on Vimy Ridge for a while and then come down to take part in the attack on the Somme. And on the 15th September 1916, they were detailed alongside 4 tanks, 4 of those tanks being used for the very first time in history to capture the wood. Now, quite a lot of officers within the division were not happy with the initial plan that had been put forward for the assault on this, and they, looking at how churned up the ground was around High Wood and within the wood itself, they weren't sure that tanks could properly operate under those conditions. But the assault went in, led by the 18th London Regiment, the London Irish Rifles, 17th London Regiment, the Poplar and Stepney Rifles, and they suffered quite extensive losses as they tried to push into the wood and capture this ground. The tanks struggled to get up, some of them ditched, they couldn't penetrate the wood. They were able to provide some localised covering fire with their machine guns or 6-pounders, but it was an infantry battle at the point of the bayonet, and further battalions like the 20th Londons, the Blackheath and Woolwich, the Civil Service Rifles came up, the Post Office Rifles got into the wood and fought their way through, and eventually the position was captured with considerable loss on the part of the London battalions that were here. But their fight was not over. After High Wood, they continued in the ground beyond it towards a fortified farm complex called Eaucourt l'Abbaye, and beyond that an ancient burial mound called the Butte de Warlencourt, but that's a story for another day. Territorial army, territorial force as it was then, units tend to have very good old comrades associations after the war, and as I've mentioned on this podcast before, there's often a connection between that and the creation of a divisional memorial or the publication of a divisional history. And in the case of the 47th London Division, they did both. They published a really excellent divisional history, which is available free online as a PDF download from the Internet Archive, or there's a Naval and Military Press reprint, which I'll put a link to on the podcast website. And they erected 2 divisional memorials here on the Somme. This one we're standing in front of now here at High Wood, and another in Martinpuy, which we mentioned on a previous podcast episode. This one was built on that shattered ground of the wood, and by the 1990s it was beginning to subside. It was a bit more like an archway originally, not just the cross that we see now. That was the centrepiece of it, and it was then renovated and the main bulk of the arch taken down and the cross put in its place instead. So we see an amended memorial, and I'll put a picture of what it once looked like again on the podcast website. So here, when we look back, standing at the memorial, turn around and look back, we're looking across those open fields back towards Bazentin and Crucifix Corner, and we can see Caterpillar Valley Cemetery across to our left. We're looking across that open ground where so many attacks came in, and that final attack approached here on the 15th September when these London lads came up here supported by those tanks. To the left of the memorial there are some smaller monuments, plaques really. There's one on the tree to the Post Office Rifles, and there is a tree planted here in the 1980s by Don Price, who was a veteran of the 20th Battalion, the Royal Fusiliers. They were the public schools battalion, and they'd attacked alongside Robert Graves's 2nd Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers in the attack here on the 20th of July 1916. That was the attack, again from a previous podcast episode, you'll remember, in which Robert Graves was wounded. Now, when he wrote that up in Goodbye to All That, his memoir of the Great War, he's very critical of the 20th Fusiliers, Royal Fusiliers, at the Public Schools Battalion. He said that the rest of the division called them chocolate soldiers because while these tough regulars of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers received bottles of liquor from their family back home, the men in the Public Schools Battalion would receive nice little packages of chocolate, and somehow he was expressing that the rest of the army felt that they weren't proper soldiers. Don Price took great exception to this. He was a veteran that I met on several occasions, who was an early member of the Western Front Association, and he, to put it mildly, was not at all amused with Graves's account of his battalion's assault on the wood, and very much took that to heart. So he came back here with Keith Quabell, one of our Ledger battlefield guides, on quite a few occasions in the 70s and 80s, and in the 80s, as part of an effort connected to the Western Front Association, they placed a little tree here in memory of the Public Schools Battalion guys, Don Price's comrades, who'd fallen in the attack here in July of 1916. From here we'll continue along the edge of the wood, and there's one last memorial to see before we get to the cemetery, and that's a little cairn. I mean, High Wood really has a staggering number of memorials, but that's not surprising when you consider the number of units that took part in the fighting here. There's a memorial cairn, and this one dates from the 70s. It commemorates the men of the 9th Battalion, the Highland Light Infantry. They were a Scottish territorial battalion that were in the same division as Don Price's 20th Royal Fusiliers and Robert Graves's 2nd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and they took part in the fighting here in July 1916. And the cairn is said to be the average height of a member of the battalion, and each of the stones within the cairn commemorates a man from the battalion who fell in the action of High Wood. The monument was placed here by the son of one of the survivors of the battalion in the 1970s, and it is now maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, as I understand it, because he gave money for them to continue with the maintenance and ensure that it didn't fall into a state of disrepair. So passing that monument, we're on our final lap now to London Cemetery and Extension, which we can just see ahead of us, and that'll be our next stop. London Cemetery and Extension is one of the largest cemeteries here on the Somme battlefields, and really it deserves a podcast of its own, and we will return to do that in due course. But it's important to come here as part of this walk because it ties up a lot of the strands of what we've talked about over the course of this journey from Caterpillar Valley. As we come into the initial part of the cemetery, this is the original London Cemetery. The large extension at the back was not here originally. In fact, as you came through the gate here when the cemetery was first made permanent, the cross of sacrifice was just on the right. That's a bit of open grass now. The original graves, which number just over 100, are largely men from the 47th London Division, buried in shell holes in front of the wood after the capture of the position. But if you look amongst the graves, you will see some men from other units as well. The extension, as we walk through the archway or through the hedge at the back of the collection of graves in the original London Cemetery, takes us into the extension, and this is a much, much bigger burial ground. Buried in the London Cemetery extension, which was added in the late 1920s, are just over 3,700 graves from British and a wide variety of Commonwealth regiments that fought in this area. But it was a cemetery that remained open then right up to the outbreak of the Second World War, and it was tended during World War II by one of the local gardeners. It reopened again after the Second World War, and burials continue. There's a World War II plot of graves of men killed in the fighting in the Somme region at the two ends of the war in 1940 with the Blitzkrieg and in the Liberation period in 1944, as well as quite a few men from Bomber Command who were shot down going to and from raids across this part of France in the intervening years. Those graves are largely collected around the rear of the Cross of Sacrifice, which, following the building of the extension, was moved from the front of the cemetery right to the back of it, where we can see the trees at the far end. So the World War II graves are there. But when we look at the First World War, the Great War graves that are in here, these aren't just men who were killed in the Battle of the Somme. In fact, some of the very earliest burials in here, in terms of date, are from the autumn of 1914, with men who were killed in fighting very close to the town of Armentières, right up in northern France. And then we also see men who died in May and indeed the summer of 1918 close to Reims in the fighting in the Second Battle of the Marne or on the Chemin des Dames. And the reason that they're in here is because this cemetery remained open. Isolated burials along the entire length of the British front in France, from Armentières, which is right up on the border with Belgium, and the far end of it down near Reims, which is the furthest area south where British soldiers fought. Any isolated graves found in that area were brought here for reburial right up into the 1950s, possibly as late as the 1960s, when a policy was made that this cemetery was closed and that only two cemeteries would remain open, one for Belgium, which was Cement House, and one for France, which is up on the coast near Boulogne, Turlington Cemetery. And that would remain in place, both those cemeteries would remain in place for burials right up until the late 1990s, when the Commission changed its policy again. And now when a soldier is found, they try and bury him as close as possible to where he was found, or if possible, if any form of regimental insignia is found with him or his identity is ascertained, bury him if they can with men from his unit or in a cemetery where men from his unit are buried. So that whole policy of reburials has changed over time, and this cemetery here does very much reflect that and reflect a wide area of history connected with the British experience, British and Commonwealth experience on the Western Front. My old friend Yves Foucault, who I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast who told me about what they'd done in Caterpillar Valley in the interwar period by blowing up all the detritus of shells and grenades and trench mortars and everything else. He worked for many, many years for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission as a gardener. He joined them in 1947 following his national service in the French Army. And this cemetery, London Cemetery and Extension, was his very first cemetery. He said that when he began his work here, there were many of the burials in the main plots that still had wooden crosses. They'd not had time up to 1939 to replace them with headstones. So that work began as soon as the team that he was a part of arrived here and began to continue their work on making this cemetery permanent. He then dug the graves at the back round the Cross of Sacrifice for the reburial of the Second World War soldiers who were brought in from a wide area around the Somme, as we've said. And he also then reburied quite a few individual soldiers who were brought in the post-Second World War period from the farmland around the 1916 battle area, because that was continuing then as it continues now. So Eve, who I knew from my very earliest years on visiting the Somme up until his death in 1997, I always think of him when I come here. It's a cemetery that I very much connect with him. And I walk around it, as you do, and it's a cemetery where the majority of the graves are unknown soldiers. They're unidentified. As we've said before, a rank is known, a regiment, sometimes a date is on there. That may not even be the date of death. It could be the date that the body was found and then buried. These are the missing of the Great War, which was spoken about a lot in this podcast. And as I've said before, I find myself being drawn more and more over the years to spending time with these men. It's easy to come in cemeteries of the Great War and look at the guidebooks and visit the Victoria Cross recipients and visit men who were shot at dawn and visit senior officer casualties. People just walk straight past the unknown burials because they're unidentified. There's no name on there. Who are they? For me, it causes me to pause and think and reflect on that very subject. Who were these men? How did they meet their end? They somehow feel occasionally a bit forgotten, and I don't like that feeling. So I find myself being drawn to them a lot. And that is really going back to what I said at the very beginning, as we begin to emerge into this new world and we're able to return to places like this. That is the power of these places, the power of what draws us back time and time again to the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.